Welcome back to Dano Does Things. This week we are going to do some science. I've been getting really into felt craft lately, and I want to know the best way to color felt. Like, not just put a different color felt onto a different color felt, but how to actually color the felt itself without dyeing it or going through an elaborate process. So I've chosen a few mediums that I have around my house, and I'm going to experiment on both white and black felt and just see what I can do and if I can get some color to show up on the felt. I'm guessing I won't be able to get a lot on the black felt, but you know what? I'm experimenting, so you don't have to. In no particular order, I chose 7 different mediums that I just had already at my house. They are watercolor, acrylics, pastels, paint pens, wool, thread, and makeup. I feel like some of these might work really well, and I feel like some of them might not work very well, but we'll see. For some inexplicable reason, I decided to make a grading system, and so I'm going to be grading each medium in 5 different categories. There's going to be ease of use, so how easy it is to use, obviously. Time, how long it takes to get color onto the felt. Pigmentation, which is just how much color actually transfers to the felt. Blendability, so the ability of the medium to not just be solid colors, just have like an ombre sort of effect. And then transference, so that'll be how well it sticks to the felt at the end of it, if I can rub it off or not, or if it transfers to, you know, my hands or clothes or anything like that. So without further ado, let's start with our first experiment. All right, first up is watercolor. I'm going to use purple for everything because I think it's the only color I have in all of the different mediums, so it'll just be more fair. We're going to use quite a bit of watercolor. It's a pretty light pigment, so we're going to get it pretty thick to start with. I don't think it's going to show at all on the black, but let's give it a try. Yeah, very much not showing up at all on the black. I'm trying to get a little more color, but nope. And you can see that because I'm dragging my brush, it's actually splattering paint all over my table as well. Oh God. That was my fault, not the paint. Let's try the white. Okay, so you can see some color, though obviously it's quite patchy. Try to use a bit more force and a bit more water. Okay, so the more water you use, the more it's gonna sink in here. You definitely need to use a lot of water. All right, well, we'll let that dry and set it aside, and we'll move on to our second medium, acrylics. All right, now we have our acrylics ready to go. We've got some purple here, and we'll just see what happens. I'm gonna add just a little bit of water to start. Okay, so you can actually see that on the black. I don't know if it's showing up that well on camera, but I can definitely see some color difference. Okay, you can see it for a bit and then it definitely soaks in, and you can see it's soaking through the felt as well. Let's try a bit on the white here. Definitely need more water than you might usually use with acrylics to get that sort of even tone there, but definitely getting some color. Okay, definitely soaking through to the other side because this felt is quite full of water now to try to blend out the color, but all right. That is acrylics. We'll set that aside to dry as well, and we'll move on to pastels. All right, I'm going to try to ignore the fact that I got paint on my table and move on to the pastels. This is just Faber-Castell soft pastels, so we'll see. Ooh, definitely seeing color on the black, which is nice. Let's see if I can do some color and then blend it out. Obviously, pastels can be kind of messy as well. You can probably shave off some of the pigment and use a brush to apply it, I'm guessing, but I like these mini pastels. They're pretty easy to use and just get color where you want, but also all over your hands. Let's try this white here. It's definitely getting a bit dusty from the texture of the felt scraping against the pastel, but the coverage of the color is quite good, actually. I don't know if you can actually see on the black there, but it definitely did come out quite a bit, so looks pretty good. Well, we'll clean up my fingers here and move on to paint pens. Next up is paint pens. The one I'm using are Acrylics by Archer and Olive. You always got to give paint pens a really good shake before you use them. I've actually been shaking this for about a minute off camera. Let's get some color flowing and see what happens. It's definitely catching a lot on the felt fibers, so it's definitely pulling on the fibers quite a bit. But the color's actually laying down quite nicely so far. Okay, give it another little shake and try out on the white. You can see I've got fibers all over my brush there already. You can sort of taper it out with blending. Not terrible. Let's cap up these pens and move on to wool. Okay, it might not be super clear with my description when I just said wool, but what I mean is needle felting additional wool onto the felt. Now I know that this does work in a sense. I've definitely needle felted onto wool before, but I really wanted to just have it as a comparison for all the other techniques because it's definitely a way to get color onto your wool. Of course, this is probably going to be one of the higher in the time-consuming category, though not as high as the next one probably. The one nice thing is you don't need a lot of wool to cover an area. Definitely looks more blended on the black just because you can't see all the big gaps. There's still gaps, but just the colors are harder to see with this dark purple. All right, I could really take forever to fiddle and perfect with this, but I think that gives us sort of a good idea of what felting is capable of doing onto felt. So we'll move on to the next medium, which is thread. All right, next up we have thread. Now I generally enjoy embroidering on felt. I wouldn't say it's easier, but it just feels nice because the felt is quite sturdy and it takes thread really well. And I do know there is a technique for embroidery called thread painting, I believe, where you fill in large sections with thread and you're basically, like, think of a paint by numbers, but instead of filling it in with paint, you're filling it in with short stitches. And people can make really, really beautiful and defined work, but of course it takes a long time. Okay, that tiny section took me nearly 5 minutes to do, which is like a lot. So I'm gonna do the white one now, but we're just gonna zoom ahead because it's gonna be the same. All right, there is the thread. I did longer stitches on this one and shorter stitches on this one just to see what it looked like, and it looks like embroidery, which isn't surprising because it's embroidery thread. But let's move on to our final medium, which is makeup. All right, obviously this is not the most expensive makeup palette because why would I use a really nice makeup palette for this? But it was purple, so let's see what happens. Just trying the white here. All right. Not too bad, but very messy. But now that I have all of my samples done, let's get into rating them. All right, so the results are in. I'm gonna go through the score of each one and why I gave it that score, and then I'll give you my overall ranking. So for watercolors, I gave it a 2 for ease of use, just because you had to use a lot of water and had to really sort of press it in there to get some pigment, and obviously it didn't even show up on the black. Time, I gave it a 3, and I only knocked it down to that because obviously it didn't take that long to do, but the drying time really adds to it. For pigmentation, I went with a 3. You can get some there, but it really sinks into the wool and you can't really see it obviously again on the black. I also gave it a 3 in blendability. You can get that sort of ombre effect, but it definitely is patchy and not super smooth. And for transference, I also gave it a 3. Once it's dry, it doesn't transfer, but when it's still wet, it definitely transfers. And if you're trying to make something with a lot of pieces, you probably will be transferring to other ones if you haven't waited a really long time for them to dry. For the acrylics, I gave ease of use a 2, same as watercolors, just similar experience, just trying to have to load up and press the color really well into the felt. Time, I also gave it a 3, and again, similar reasons. The time it took to put on wasn't that bad, but the drying time was bad. Pigmentation, I gave it a 4. You can see a lot of color in there, and if you're really looking for like dark colors, then there you go. But blendability, I gave it a 2 because it was really hard, much harder than the watercolors, to get that sort of even blend going on. And of course, can't see it well on the black either. And for transference, I gave it a 3, similar to the watercolors. Doesn't really transfer when it's not dry, or when it is dry, but when it's not dry, it's going to transfer a ton. And that's just going to be really annoying if you're not waiting for it to dry. Moving on to pastels, I gave it a 4 for ease of use. It was quite nice when you have especially just the little mini pastels that you can just sort of scrape along, and it didn't make that big of a mess. Time, I also gave it a 4. It was a pretty quick process to lay down the color. I didn't have to layer it up too much. I also gave pigmentation a 4. You can actually see it in the black and the white, which is nice, and it's a pretty deep color. And I gave it a 4 as well for blendability. It was probably one of the best to be able to get that soft blend going on where you can actually see the ombre and it doesn't just go from like one color to white. For transference though, I did have to give it a 2. The pastel definitely comes off when you rub it. You might be able to fix it in there somehow, or once you've rubbed off sort of the loose stuff, it might not be as bad, but for now it's pretty bad. But if you're not handling whatever you're painting, you might be able to get away with it. For the paint pens, I gave it a 3 for ease of use. It was fairly easy to get color on there, but my pen kept snagging in the felt and it kept pulling up little pieces of felt, and so that wasn't very easy to do. Time, I gave it a 4. It went down pretty quickly. For pigmentation, I gave it a 3. You got quite a bit of color down there, but it was quite splotchy. Blendability, I gave it a 2. It was hard to sort of make any natural looking blend with a pen. But for transference, I gave it a 5 because this stuff is not going anywhere. Once it's on, it is on. So that's a bonus. For wool, ease of use, I gave it a 1 because you need so much more equipment to actually do needle felting with the wool. You need the felting mat, you need the wool, you need the needles, and it's a whole other technique. So I gave it a 1 on that. I also gave it a 1 on, oh no wait, I gave it a 2. Oh, good for me. I also gave it a 2 on time because obviously it took a very long time to do. I gave it a 5 on pigmentation though, because I mean, you can really see the pigmentation. It looks great. For blendability, I gave it a 2. It's hard to blend wool out very precisely. You're always going to sort of get these jagged edges and sharp edges with the wool. But for transference, it also got a 5 because it doesn't transfer at all. I mean, you might get a few threads of wool falling out, but not if you've actually felted it properly. And I just kind of stopped with this because it was taking too much time. For the thread, ease of use, I gave it a 1 as well. Again, it's another technique that you have to know, and you have to have all these extra equipment. I mean, it's not a lot, it's like a needle and thread, but still, if you're just looking to do felt work, you might not be doing embroidery work as well. Time, I obviously gave it a 1 as well because it takes forever. That's probably the least favorite thing of mine about the thread, is that it takes forever. Pigmentation, I gave it a 5 because, I mean, you can see the thread quite easily. But I gave it a 2 for blendability because unless you're really good at blending thread and you're using single threads, it doesn't look that great. I mean, to blend. Obviously, this is the style. If you want that, awesome, but you're not going to get that nice soft blend. Transference also gets a 5 because not going anywhere. Finally, with makeup, I gave it a 4 in ease of use. It was pretty easy to get on there, even though it was a bit messy, and I gave it a 4 in time as well. It really laid down quite quickly. For pigmentation, I gave it a 3, and I think I'm just being biased because I don't really like the color. I should probably actually give it a 4, but no, I'm gonna give it a 3. It just didn't, it's a little bit patchy and doesn't look, I don't know. I just think it's a 3. For blendability, I gave it a 4. It also does a pretty natural blend out, which, you know, I should have expected with makeup. You're supposed to be blended. For transference, I also gave this one a 2 because it is falling everywhere, and I should honestly just give it a 1 because the amount of transference when I was applying the product should count against it because it was a lot. So our final scores for these mediums, tied in last place with 14 points each, we've got watercolors, acrylics, and thread. Then next in line is wool with 16 points. And then tied for second, we have paint pens and makeup. And in first place, we have pastels. Now, the ability of the pastels to provide a lot of pigment and a lot of blendability was what I really liked. Obviously, the transference was where it lost a lot of marks, and the pastels and makeup are pretty similar. I would say that there's less transference with the pastels than there is with the makeup, so that's sort of why it edged it out just a bit. And as well, you can see the purple, I think, best with the pastels compared to even the makeup. It just actually shows some pigment without completely disappearing into the black felt. So I feel like it'll be a little bit more versatile. So overall, soft pastels are my winner. I hope you enjoyed this video and got something out of it because I very much did, and I'm going to be using this going forward. So if you like this video and you want to see more like this, please give this a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, maybe subscribe. I put out crafty videos every Wednesday. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.